Welcome to the second volume about the life of Beethoven. I will link the previous video in the eye and in the description box below. We left Beethoven in Heiligenstadt, where he escaped the bustle of Vienna to come to terms with his encroaching deafness. Before he left Heiligenstadt, he wrote what scholars call the Heiligenstadt Testament, outlining his will to live for his art. From Beethoven himself. But what a humiliation for me when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Or someone standing next to me heard a shepherd singing, and again I heard nothing. Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that and I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. It seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me. This artistic and moral revelation in Heiligenstadt brought about a renewed sense of life in Beethoven and was reflected in his works of the period. On returning to Vienna, he remarked to one of his students, "I am not very well satisfied with the work I have done thus far. From this day on, I shall take a new way." That new way was the start of what some historians like to call Beethoven's heroic period. The works written directly after his trip to Heiligenstadt can be seen as more profoundly innovative, pointing in a new direction and moving further away from the legacy of Haydn or Mozart. In his third symphony, he goes to increasingly outlying keys, extending the tonal harmony used by classical composers. Beethoven originally dedicated the third symphony to Napoleon Bonaparte, whom he believed embodied the democratic and anti-monarchical ideas of the French Revolution. As a strong opponent to all forms of tyranny, Beethoven admired Napoleon as a champion of the poor and the man that would overthrow the old oppression. In the autumn of 1804, Beethoven withdrew his dedication of the Third Symphony to Napoleon, lest it cost him the composer's fee paid to him by a noble patron. So Beethoven rededicated his Third Symphony to Prince Joseph Franz Maximilian Lobkowitz. Nonetheless, despite such bread and butter consideration, the politically idealistic Beethoven titled the work Bonaparte. In reaction to the news that Bonaparte had declared himself emperor, Beethoven's secretary and pupil Ferdinand Ries said that he angrily tore the dedication page from the symphony and exclaimed, "So he is no more than a common mortal. Now too he will tread underfoot of all rights of man, indulge only his ambition. Now he will think of himself superior to all men and become a tyrant." The title page had to be redone, this time with the title Sinfonia Eroica. Many of his greatest works were composed in this middle heroic period. They include the Ramovsky string quartets and the Waldstein and Appassionata piano sonatas, the 4th through 8th symphonies, the oratorio Christ on the Mount of Olives, and the first edition of the opera Fidelio, and his violin concerto. The opera would give Beethoven trouble for years. It was not well received on its first hearing, and so it was edited by Beethoven and a number of librettists 3 times before it saw great acclaim. George Friedrich Trenchke rewrote the libretto the last time, pacing the opera in a much more structured manner to Beethoven's liking. Every time the opera was revived, Beethoven wrote another overture to go with it. There are 4 versions of it, entitled Leonore, the original name for the production, 1, 2, and 3, and Fidelio, the final name of the production. Modern productions place the overture Leonore No. 3 between the 2 scenes in the second act. One of the most famous numbers in the opera is the Prisoner's Chorus, heard when the political prisoners of the opera are temporarily set free from their jail cells. The chorus begins softly, with just a few held chords. Then a bassoon solo leads into a woodwind section, and the chorus of men gradually enters until they are singing full out. Let's hear the Prisoner's Chorus from Beethoven's opera Fidelio. autumn of 1808, after having been rejected for a position at the Royal Theatre, Beethoven had received an offer from Napoleon's brother Jerome Bonaparte, then King of Westphalia, for a well-paid position as Kapellmeister at the court and castle. To persuade him to stay in Vienna, Archduke Rudolf, Prince Kinsky, and Prince Lobkowitz, after receiving representations from Beethoven's friends, pledged to pay him a pension of 4,000 florins a year. In that event, Archduke Rudolf paid his share of the pension on the agreed date. Kinsky, immediately called to military duty, did not contribute and died in November 1812 after falling from his horse. The Austrian currency destabilized and Lobkowitz went bankrupt in 1811, so that Beethoven eventually had to take recourse in the law, which in 1815 brought him some relief. Beethoven's problems with women were ongoing throughout his life. In his papers at his death was a letter to an immortal beloved, written in 1812. Beethoven was falling in and out of love with unsuitable women throughout the course of his life. But this letter to the immortal beloved is the only evidence that he had ever had a relationship that was reciprocal. No evidence can suggest why the letter was never sent, but it was important to Beethoven throughout the rest of his life. The identity of the intended recipient was a long subject of debate, although musicologist Maynard Solomon has convincingly demonstrated that the intended recipient must have been Antonine Brentano. Other candidates have included Julie Gulicardi, Therese Malfatti, and Josephine Brunswick. Another aspect of Beethoven's personal life that troubled him in his later years was the custody of his nephew Karl. Beethoven's brother Caspar died from tuberculosis in 1815 after Beethoven tried to convince Caspar not to marry his wife Joanna. After the death of his brother, Beethoven sued to have full custody of Karl because he thought his mother was morally unfit to be a mother due to her previous convictions for theft. Through numerous legal battles, both in the court of the aristocracy and in the lower court, Beethoven gained then lost custody of Karl. In 1820, Beethoven gained custody of Karl the final time, and Karl became a part of the Beethoven household. Beethoven was overbearing with Karl, so much so that Karl attempted suicide in 1826 in an attempt to get away from his uncle. All of these personal problems did not help the deterioration of Beethoven's health. In this time period, Beethoven would get sick over and over again with what was called rheumatic fever in the time period. Notes reveal that Beethoven was suffering from stomach complaints, fever, listlessness, and a distended stomach. Modern analysis has centered on the diagnosis of cirrhosis of the liver for all of these issues. It was to plague Beethoven for the rest of his life. The last period of his life was centered around increasingly complex works, delving far further into unrelated keys than his contemporaries. This final period, as it's called in some musicological circles, had a number of startling compositions, including the Missa Solemnis, opus 123, the 33 Diabelli Variations, opus 120, and the Ninth Symphony. Writing in spurts between illnesses, it took him multiple years to finish each of these compositions. Not happy with the Viennese reception to his more challenging works, Beethoven inquired about premiering the Missa Solemnis and the Ninth Symphony in Berlin instead of Vienna. When his Viennese admirers learned of this, they pleaded with him to arrange a local performance. Beethoven was won over, and the symphony was first performed, along with sections of the Missa Solemnis, on the 7th of May, 1824, at great acclaim at the Carntor Theatre. Beethoven insisted on conducting, even though his deafness had progressed to a startling level. A compromise was reached where the conductor Michael Umlauf was next to him during the concert, conducting as well, and Beethoven beat time, although Umlauf had warned the singers and orchestra to ignore him. And because of his deafness, he was not even aware of the applause which followed until he was turned to witness it. The repeat of that concert, a few days later, was to be Beethoven's last public concert. The Ninth Symphony was something different than the rest of Beethoven's output. The symphony is regarded by many critics and musicologists as Beethoven's greatest work and one of the supreme achievements in the history of music. One of the best-known works of classical music, it stands as one of the most performed symphonies in the world. The symphony was the first example of a major composer using voices in the symphony. The words are sung during the final fourth movement of the symphony by 4 vocal soloists and a chorus. They were taken from the Ode to Joy, a poem written by Friedrich Schiller in 1785 and revised in 1803, with text additions made by Beethoven. It has been seen as the culmination of Beethoven's political outlook and egalitarianism, where all men become brothers. The use of Schiller's poem fit into a progressive politics of the time, after the deadly force of the Napoleonic Wars. The use of the choral ending can be foreshadowed in his Chorale Fantasy, which is a piano concerto with a chorus at the end. Beethoven gradually builds up to the ending of the work to make the transition to the voices inevitable. Let's hear a section at the end of the work with the chorus. In this video, I am conducting the Boulder Chamber Symphony. His final works, the string quartets opus 127, 132, and 130, came from a commission by the Russian nobleman Nicholas Borisovich, Prince Golitsyn. The prince requested 3 string quartets at any price Beethoven would offer them for. Other string quartets written around the same time include quartets 12 through 16. Through these quartets, Beethoven did what he did for the piano concerto and the symphony, completely redefined the genre. The demands on all of the players, especially the first violin, are extraordinary. They contain some of the longest movements that have ever been written for the string quartet. They foreshadowed the tonal movements 100 years into the future with daring tonality. Opinion has changed considerably from the time of their first bewildered reception. These 6 quartets, including the Gross Fugue, are widely considered among the greatest musical compositions of all time. The Frankfurt School philosopher Theodor Adorno, in particular, thought highly of them, and Igor Stravinsky called the Gross Fugue an absolutely contemporary piece of music that will be contemporary forever. Their forms and ideas inspired and continue to inspire musicians and composers such as Richard Wagner and Bela Bartok. The Gross Fugue began as the final for Opus 130, but was deemed too long after the first performance. Beethoven spun it off as its own work, giving it its own opus number 133. An immense double fugue, it was universally condemned by contemporary music critics. A reviewer writing for the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung in 1826 described the fugue as incomprehensible, like Chinese, and a confusion of babble. However, critical opinion of the work has steadily risen since the early 20th century, and it is now considered among Beethoven's greatest achievements. Let's hear some of the beginning of the Gross Fugue, here played by the Tallich Quartet from a 1977 recording. We will be hearing the first fugal section. The first fugal section is a double fugue marked allegro. Here the main theme competes against another subject, which is also fiery and assertive. In December 1826, Beethoven went to spend some time with his younger brother Johann in his countryside manor Schloss Wasserhof near Gnexendorf. They were there with convalescent Karl after his attempted suicide. Johann and Beethoven had a mighty row one night because Beethoven demanded that Johann write his wife and her illegitimate child out of Johann's will, leaving everything to Karl. When Johann outright refused, Beethoven and Karl left quickly, taking an open carriage back to Vienna in the cold of December. Beethoven caught ill during the hour's ride back to the city. Beethoven was attended until his death by Dr. Andreas Warvusch, who throughout December noticed symptoms including fever, jaundice, dropsy, with swollen limbs, coughing, and breathing difficulties. Several operations were carried out to tap off the excess fluid in Beethoven's abdomen. Karl stayed by Beethoven's bedside during December, but left after the beginning of January to join the army in Iglau and did not see his uncle again. Beethoven died on the 26th of March, 1827 at the age of 56. An autopsy revealed that Beethoven suffered from significant liver damage, which may have been due to his heavy alcohol consumption, and also considerable dilation of the auditory and other related nerves. Beethoven's funeral procession in Vienna on March 29, 1827 was attended by an estimated 10,000 people. Franz Schubert and the violinist Joseph Maysetter were among the torchbearers. A funeral oration by the poet Franz Grillparzer was read. Beethoven was buried in the Waring Cemetery, northwest of Vienna, after a requiem mass at the Church of the Holy Trinity in Alterstrasse. Beethoven's remains were exhumed for study in 1863 and moved in 1888 to Vienna's Zentralfriedhof, where they were reinterred in a grave adjacent to that of Schubert. Beethoven's legacy was one of redefinition and revolution. He monumentally changed almost every genre in which he composed, including the piano sonata, piano concerto, symphony, and string quartet. Beethoven's works long held sway in classical music, with the next few generations of composers held up to the Beethoven standard. A transitionary figure, he ushered in the Romantic period in symphonic music by focusing on the power of emotion instead of the crystalline formal structure of the classical period. His works are still played in every season by all major orchestras in the world. This year, 2020, marks the 250th anniversary of his birth. Many Beethoven concerts were canceled by the pandemic, but his popularity does not wane. Thank you for going on this journey through Beethoven's life with me. I had a great time creating this video for you. If you're looking for a more in-depth study of Beethoven's life, written in an accessible way, I suggest the book Beethoven, The Man Revealed by John Suchet. It's written in a compelling style, and the discussion of the particulars of music are held to a minimum, so you don't need to know how to read music to enjoy the book. I'll leave a link to it in the description box below. Also in the description box is the link to my bibliography for this video and to my Patreon, where you can support the making of these videos. Thank you again, and see you in my next video.